So, our first 20-minute panel will be set as the stage. We will define the different roles of space outreach or in space outreach, and we will hear space outreach from the angle of our specific guest. I'm pleased to call our first panel on the virtual stage, and these are Professor Chris Welch, Dr. Marianne and Kim Macharia, if I'm pronouncing that right. And with that, I'm handing over to your host of the session, the wonderful Kate Arkless-Gray. Kate, over to you.
Hello, and welcome to the first session of the Impulse 2021 conference. It's really great to have you with us this afternoon, and we're going to do our best to keep you entertained for the next couple of hours. Now, I am very aware that we only have 20 minutes for this, so I'm going to set myself a little timer, but I'm ready to be cut off by the bell. You'll be saved by the bell. I'd like to invite all of the panelists on this panel to put your cameras on and be seen. Don't let me be here on my own. While you do that, I'm Kate Arkless-Gray. Most people tend to call me Spacekate because, frankly, it's easier to say and easier to spell, and it correctly identifies me as someone who's very passionate about space and telling stories about space. So I'm a qualified broadcast journalist and currently working predominantly as a communications strategist. I'll be your host for this first session, and we're trying to get a range of perspectives on space communication and outreach for you. And we've got a really great bunch of panelists, but we've only got 20 minutes, so let me introduce that panel to you now. And we really are going global. First, over to the US with Kim Macharia, founder of space industry PR firm Nyota Communications, and she's also chair of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee at the Space Frontier Foundation. Do you want to give us a wave?
Hello, everyone.
Great. Then we're going up to Canada to meet Marianne, who started out as a planetary scientist and has crossed both the Arctic and Antarctic off the bucket list. I have to say I am hugely, hugely envious of meteorite hunting in Antarctica, but I think we'll have to save that story for another day. And she is now the executive director of the Canadian Association of Science Centres. Now we're going to do a quick hop back over the pond to Strasbourg, France, and occasionally the UK, for Chris Welch, Professor of Space Engineering and Director of the Masters in Space Studies at the International Space University, of which I am an alum, and I believe another of our panelists is too. So there's just one more that we need to convert over to the course. And as well as being a fellow of pretty much every single space society that you could think of, Chris is the president-elect of the British Interplanetary Society, which is, I believe, the oldest space society in the world. Now, since we're all around the world, and you, I suppose, the audience are also around the world, it looks like, I wanted to just get an icebreaker question just to get us started and get the ball rolling. So I set all the panelists a little bit of homework, and I asked them, which space story, past, present, or future, do you wish that you were or could be involved with? And let's start off with Kim. What's your answer for us?
My answer would be I would love to do public relations for the first flight that would include the first African woman and Latino woman to the ISS. I think there are just so many incredible stories that you can get from that, whether you're talking about on the contracting side or actually just telling the stories of these actual astronauts.
That sounds like a good one to be involved in. What about you, Marianne?
I would definitely have to say the upcoming 2023 Artemis 2 mission, where there's going to be a Canadian on board flying by the moon. It's going to be a huge deal for Canada. I can certainly say science centers are going to be there telling that story. But when that announcement was made, everyone is so excited for that, and we can't wait.
Yeah, I think my answer would have been something around first woman on the moon, but I would have hoped to have been telling that as a first person as the first woman on the moon. Sadly, I don't think that's going to happen. So, Chris, what about you?
Well, talking about regrets, Kate, I'm going to go back in time a bit. I wish I had a better left nostril. The reason for this is 25, 30 years ago, I was a candidate for the Juno mission to the Mir space station, which Helen Sharman was finally selected for and did a wonderful job. I made it to candidate maybe 24 or something like that before being ejected on the grounds of a defective left nostril. Yeah, I wish I had a better nostril, and I wish that I had got to go to the Mir space station.
Well, that's that's a good roundup of stories, and we all seem to have focused there on a sort of human spaceflight angle, which is kind of interesting, and maybe we'll dig into that a bit more. But now we've got a bit of insight into the topics that you're personally excited by. Let's get down to business. So now, I come from a journalism background, and I have on more than one occasion been faced with, a grumpy editor who turns and says, well, why should I care? What's this got to do with me? So tell me, from each of your perspectives, why do you think that it's important that we do space outreach? And what is it that you do, or the places where you work does, to engage people with the topic of space? And Marianne, let's go with you.
Yeah, I gotta say, this notion of space being this literal gateway into the fields of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. I represent a sector that is in the curiosity business. This is what science centers do. They create moments of inspiration and spark. And we recently actually did a research project with the Canadian Space Agency across our sector. And having space speakers, astronauts, those are moments. We have a great story from Commander Chris Hadfield of how he was initially inspired as a child when he saw an Apollo lunar sample at the Ontario Science Centre. These moments cannot be understated. So creating moments of spark as a gateway into STEM, science centers then create immersive engagement experiences that are interactive, people can ask questions, but those kind of like moments you can't beat space. You really can't. I think we can all talk about, of course, the benefits to Earth and whatever, but from the sector I represent, the curiosity business, the spark's where it's at.
I love that. I have to say, can I steal that? I'm in the, what do you do? Oh, I'm in the curiosity business.
Right?
That's great. I love it. And, one thing I think is, how do you, the centers make space real? Because, we see space kind of everywhere. It's, space and dinosaurs, kids are always really excited by them. So how do you make it real for the people that come to visit your centers?
Yeah, there's so many different ways and so many different platforms. All science centers across Canada run school visits. People probably don't realize that. They all do outreach. They all do events, obviously, in their science centers, collectively reaching, admittedly, pre-COVID, 10 million visitors. Like, this is a significant sector of engagement of youth. And when we say youth, but really we mean families. There's adults there too. And so the mechanisms, you can have the hook where you have like speakers, but then you have galleries and exhibits and hands-on material facilitated with conversations. So it's a place where people can kind of be unscripted in their exploration of an idea. It looks different than maybe a traditional classroom setting. So when a school comes to a science center, there's a wow factor there, and even just outside of space, but add space as the content, and it's like a double wow. So many offer summer camps. There'll be a space themed summer camp and things like that.
And Kim, you're from the US. You've got some incredible space centers around the country and space camp. All these things that as a kid, I didn't grow up with those things, and I'm super jealous that kids get to do that in the US. How did you go to space camp first of all?
I did not, but I actually got into space because of a space camp jacket that I found at a thrift store and inspired. I did screenwriting back in college and inspired a whole script that I wrote. And during that process, I realized that this space industry is incredibly difficult to enter into if you're born in the wrong socioeconomic background or in quote unquote the wrong country. And so that's inspired a lot of the work that I've done thus far. But kind of going back to your other question, but you asked Marianne, I think a reason why it's so important to do space outreach on the business side of things is actually workforce development. I think a lot of people find, the space industry to be quite elite and elusive. And actually, some recent event that I actually did to kind of tackle this problem or to touch upon it, I partnered with a group of nurses based in Colorado, and we had an event themed around this idea of giving nurses a chance to leap because they've stepped up time and time again throughout the course of this pandemic. And I think it's so crucial to find unique elements like that to make space more relatable, because most people don't know rocket scientists or engineers, but everyone knows a nurse. And so finding those kinds of crucial connections to make space relatable could actually benefit the industry in such a phenomenal way when it comes to addressing the big talent gap that this industry actually is encountering at this point in time.
I love that you go into space because of a thrift store jacket. I go into space because somebody gave me a NASA pin, and I told that story many times, but basically got very overexcited, made a fool of myself because I was meeting the first person I'd ever met from NASA, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's real. And the rest is history. But yeah, the skills gap in the workforce, how does education fall into sort of outreach and encouraging people to follow careers in the space industry? Chris?
Well, I think there's if you like, a utilitarian reason for doing space education and outreach, and that is, as Kim was just saying, to connect with groups who you would not normally connect with. Education in space is for those people who are already interested in space. We have to find ways to connect with those other people to build broad support for the sort of things that we're interested in. But that's only half the story. I suspect that most of the people who are here, at this event today, are not here out of a sort of rather logical reason, designed to support particular programs. That's what people at space agencies do. I suspect we are all here because we are what I would call passionate individuals. It's almost like a kind of religious calling for us. We want to preach the good word about space. We want to convince people of its value so that we collectively as a community and as a species on this planet can go off and do bigger and better things in space. And if we're going to do that, we have to do it together. Okay, it can't be just a small activity. And for me, that's the main reason for doing space outreach. It's to try and transform humanity's future.
And do you think that message works globally? Because for some people, they may have more everyday issues that they're dealing with. Is there a duty for outreach professionals to sort of paint the wider picture of space, not just the excitement of getting off the planet and exploring further, but what the benefits of space could be for us here on the ground?
Absolutely. Organizations and activities such as World Space Week, which happens every October, is UN mandated, is specifically to do that. It's to celebrate space and to show the value of space to everybody on the planet. Or the equivalent, which is coming up just this weekend, April the 12th, 60th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight. 10 years ago, it was the 50th anniversary, and at that point I was the chair of something called Yuri Gagarin 50 in the UK, and we developed what we called the Gagarin hook, because we kept trying to interest people in this, and they would say, oh, it's human spaceflight, I'm not interested. And what we found was, if you could find a way to attract people's attention using Yuri Gagarin, you could redirect it. So, for example, Yuri Gagarin saw the planet 50 years ago. If he was orbiting the planet today, what would he see? How has our planet changed? What does that mean in terms of remote sensing, in terms of climate change, in terms of the environment? And then those sort of, that sort of astronaut halo effect, I guess, can be used, very, very usefully to point out all sorts of different areas where space adds value for everybody.
Right, I'm just conscious of time. We've got 7 minutes. Okay, so let's see. What do we think? Are there any special qualifications that people need to work in communications and outreach? You know, is it important that you've been an engineer in order to explain an engineering term, or is it important that you've, you know, done a media studies degree, or is it just important to have the passion and the willingness to share that and explain things to people? Marianne, you're smiling. What do you think?
Yeah, I think as with anything, a learning mindset is the way to go. I don't have formal training in comms and media, and I am very much kind of in a role that's at that intersection. There are certainly principles to science communication that I think are essential to learn. However, you get, you know, to learning them. The last conversation you guys were just having, I kept thinking about, you know your target audience. You know, whenever you're doing anything, you have to know who your audience is and ensure that it's relevant to them. And that is going to be so different everywhere. You know, the mission I chose was Canadian because I know that's relevant to Canadians. Within Canada, there's no such thing as a general public, right? You know, it's so segmented. And so that's just like one major principle of science communication. But there are opportunities to do that kind of learning. I think the learning mindset and the kind of almost that journalistic, the curiosity mindset are really critical. I don't know if that actually completely answered the question. I think I veered off.
Good answer. I'm wondering, Kim, when you're doing your PR work, you must come across sometimes quite a complex issue or story that you're trying to explain to a more general audience. How do you balance, you know, making that understandable and accessible, but without sort of distorting or oversimplifying a topic?
Absolutely. So one topic in particular that I've had a lot of fun experimenting with is space debris. I previously worked at a startup that was all centered around teaching people how to track and observe satellites. And something that I found to be really helpful was I actually took a comedy class and that was specifically in relation to science. And I used to do stand-up in New York centered around space debris and had to, you know, deal with figuring out what actually people care to hear, how much information they can take in at a time. And I used that information to inform some of my other talks I gave later that year at events, including things like WakandaCon and such. And I think given that people who are interested in space, I like to think that we're all kind of risk takers. And comedy is a very risk-taking kind of endeavor. I think it's really worthwhile to pursue those kinds of non-traditional approaches to learning how to communicate these difficult topics. And I think humor is always the best direction to start with when you're doing something like that. Make them laugh first, then make them learn.
Yeah, I wish we had like an extra 20 minutes and we would just like, the rest of us on the panel would just mute ourselves and get you to do your stand-up set. But sadly, not today. But we're going to book that in though. I'm going to tap you up for that. Chris, what do you think about, you know, there's all these huge stories out there. Do you think that sometimes we overhype things? You know, are we going to Mars tomorrow? Or, you know, is there a danger in like over-promising things from space and then perhaps under-delivering?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. This morning, my master's students were doing one of their final exams, the kind of 4-hour interdisciplinary exam, and we kind of asked them to assess Elon Musk's plans for going to Mars by 2026. Now personally, I don't doubt that he will get to Mars eventually. I'm just not quite sure it's going to be within the next 5 years. And, I think that's a very interesting cultural phenomenon that whirls around Elon Musk. You know, on the one hand, it excites a lot of people. On the other hand, it routinely overpromises. We've seen this across the whole space tourism sector.
Does that make it harder for agencies who are trying to get public funds for missions to Mars, do you think?
I think it does, because inevitably they seem a bit boring by comparison sometimes, and B, difficult to justify their budgets when the private sector is doing so well. Now, okay, you can argue about where society should be allocating its resources to space agencies or to private space companies, and maybe that situation is changing. But if you're not in the space sector, that's probably an argument that is way too nuanced for you. And so those of us who are in space and doing space education and outreach need to sort of think carefully about how we react to that. Is sending a Tesla into space, a kind of inspirational act that shows the democratization of space, or is it B, a waste of resources, on a rich man's dream?
Which is it, Chris?
Bit of both, really. I mean, I'm for instance, I'm in the lucky position of having been able to send a payload to the International Space Station, and I put one of my poems on it because I could. So, what's the difference between me and Elon Musk, apart from several billion dollars? There needs to be a broader discussion about the democratization of space and what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. When Peter Beck launched, his space disco ball, on one of his rockets, there was a lot of discussion. The scientists thought this was awful. Other people thought this was an appropriate thing as humanity expands into space. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but it makes for a very interesting discussion.
Certainly does, and I really wish we had time for it. I did promise the panel that I would let them know about 4 or 5 minutes before the end of the session, so we could all put in our last, what did we miss out on saying? Unfortunately, we've got 1 minute, so quick, think of the one thing you want everybody to take away from this session. And Kim, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think something that's really important for people to start thinking more about is figuring out how to approach new communities in unique ways, and really starting to differentiate your approaches to outreach, and finding people that typically are kept out of this world and figuring out ways to bring them in.
Hugely important. All right, Marianne?
Yeah, building on that actually, and based on what Kim said earlier about stand-up comedy, listen to your audience. What do they actually want to know? I think as space passionate enthusiasts, we're like, it's amazing. You should think it's amazing, and we forget to listen. Not everyone is like us, right? And it's critical, especially as we're engaging new audiences.
And Chris?
Well, it's similar. Don't go after the same old audiences, and don't use the same old techniques. Find something different audiences, different ways of communicating with them.
Brilliant. Well, that sounds like a great way to finish it. You've got a challenge there, everybody. Go and find those audiences, listen to them, find the ones not being served properly, and find a brand new way of communicating. And let's do this together. I'm stopping now, only 35 seconds over budget on the time there. So thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.